Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 22 of IGEL Weekly. I'm your host, Andy Whiteside. I got Chris Feeney with me. Chris, how's it going?
Going well, Andy. Vacation Eve.
Vacation Eve. Yeah, that's you brought it up, so I'll bring it up. We're going to talk about user experience. We're going to talk about security. We had several podcasts yesterday. One of the podcasts we talked about was, not talking about vacations and stuff this time of year because of, security. But one of the guys I had on, like, look, man, telling people on a podcast that I'm going out of town for a day or so is the least of my worries these days. There's so many more other things to be worried about. And with all the extra intelligence, analytics, webcams or cameras you have around your house, it's not like the old days where you had to make sure your mail was brought in. That was your big concern, that and turning off the water. Now you have much bigger concerns with someone stealing your online identity than you have worried about somebody coming in and taking the cookie jar with the Christmas money in it.
Yeah, my biggest concern is making sure we all get to the airport on time through the crazy, what I imagine the long security line might be. And once that plane takes off, I'll be a little bit less stressed. But anyway, if it's me by myself, I'm good. Airport, TSA pre-check, gate, I'm good. But when you're towing a few others along, anyway.
Yeah, we have a similar scenario, and it's gotten to the point now where some of my kids are extremely anxious and want to get to the airport super early. And then some of my family members just like to kind of drag their feet and get there whenever we get there. And we've had a couple near misses. We've only missed one flight in all this time with having 4 kids. We've only missed one flight, and that's when they were really, really little. And that's when the computer systems were out at Charlotte. And I think everybody missed their flight that day.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about our topic today, user experience for traveling, and how it's changed, over the course of time. I think for a while there, I chose, I'll be all right. I know how to pack, I know how to get through security, and I didn't really necessarily go with the pre-check option when it first came out.
Mm-hmm.
And then my job changed. I knew it was going to be maybe traveling overseas, and I said, let me just go ahead and get the global entry thing. And I went there and got all that squared away. And once I got a taste of pre-check, I was like, oh man. And mine actually comes up for renewal this year, so I gotta take care of that after this trip. But
if you don't, it's the system that you go through. It's also the people that you interact with when you don't have some type of pre-check clearance. You got the person in front of you that's got their dog, and they're trying to run their dog through the scanner, or do I need to take my laptop out kind of questions. And then they go and then they have like 18 different articles of clothing they have to ask a question about. And then they've got like a 2-liter bottle of water and like, oh, I can't take this through. It's like, oh my gosh, are you kidding me?
I know. I've definitely had to bite my tongue on a few moments like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard when you're just sitting there going, come on, just let me help you out here.
Right. Well, and then we'll be traveling like you, and they've got the 4 kids. We got to get through security. So half the tickets always book on points using my tickets or my login. They always get, all those people on my ticket get TSA clearance because they're part of my package. And then the other half of the family doesn't. My wife's always in the other half, and she has to go through security. And the kids and I will go, and we'll go sit in the airport lounge or something for an hour while they get through security. And it's never a great way to start a trip because it creates tension from the family.
I'm laughing because I was strategizing. All right. When we get to the airport, my daughter, she's not going to check a bag. We've already got her boarding pass. Just go straight to security, get through it.
Mm-hmm.
My son, he's got a bigger bag because he's coming back early, and he's got to report to school to help out with something down there. And so he's on a separate itinerary, and he's got to check a bag that's a little bit bigger. And then my wife and I've already paid for the bag, so I'm trying to find all the little shortcuts as possible. And the only one who's got pre-check is me. So I'm just like, all right, get this stuff in, just have my family just run to the security line, and I'm probably going to beat them through there anyway, being the last person probably. But it is awkward, feels bad, but I'm not going to apologize. I like pre-check. I like that user experience. And I like not having to take my shoes off, not having to take my computer out. And, as we, kind of talk about that user experience, sort of this, the other thing too is emerging out of this pandemic where there's a massive uptick in people wanting to travel. And, you know, our topic was kind of on the same lines as we come out of this this pandemic. What's the work model going to look like for a lot of companies? And I was just the other day, we were just hanging out at the pool, and I was talking with a friend that we've known for a while, and she's been in the biopharmaceutical world for years. She's in the HR kind of, or not HR, but a management role, director level type. And she's already lost employees because their company was saying, you got to come back to the office, full time or whatever. And they're like, no, I'm going to go over here because they're going to offer a much better user experience. I can work from home all the time, or only, have to go in the office. They're not forcing. And so she's worried because she's starting to lose talent retention. So, and that's kind of what our survey was wondering about, right? What can we expect, as we hopefully are on the other side of this thing?
Yeah. So yesterday was interesting for me. I did 2 podcasts on security and 1 podcast on user experience. And today we're going to do another one on user experience. I'm sure security is going to come up. I also interviewed a new potential employee, and this employee currently works a lot of extra nights and almost every weekend. And so we're talking about a world now where employees are demanding the ability to work hybrid or work remote all the time. At the same time, you have people that have jobs that require them to work nights and weekends. It really is going to be a story of the haves and the have-nots, and how technology can help the haves, but what are we going to do for the have-nots? I'm not trying to solve that on this podcast, but yesterday's conversation got me thinking about, what can technology do to make the people who are working nights and weekends, or the healthcare workers who never had the choice of working remote during the whole pandemic, how are we going to make sure that we're balancing the approach for both groups?
Yeah, I certainly, I've got a lot of friends that are in commercial real estate too. And it's been interesting to see how I haven't seen a letdown in buildings being built.
Those were already scheduled.
I know, it's like, but are they going to get filled? Here in Raleigh, for example, Allscripts moved into a whole brand new building, and I don't know how they're going to fill that out. It's like they pretty much have most of the floors in that building. Advanced Auto Parts also same thing. They moved into a new building, or have a new building with a logo on it, essentially their signage. But it remains to be seen, how occupied that will be. Nice facilities, that's for sure. But
yeah, I'm really concerned that the our economy is heavily based on real estate, both commercial and residential. I'm really concerned that the fallout of the economy is going to happen whenever we run out of money, and the commercial real estate piece becomes dried up. And the boondoggle we've had of people not driving back and forth to work and all the money they're saving, when that starts to run out, that's when I worry about the economy situation rearing its head. A couple great examples. I mean, Citrix as a company, they're closing down floors or closing down buildings that they must be renting or have been renting in the past, or maybe they own them and now they're going to sell them. I'm not sure. I went looking for real estate because I do need a hybrid workplace. I mean, look, I've always worked remote for 20 years now, and my company works remote, most of us all the time. But we do have moments in time where we need 20, 30 people in the office all at one time. So I do need some type of real estate. I went looking at properties like 2 weeks ago, and it was interesting. The real estate agent was trying to sell me on how the demand was great, and I needed to jump on this piece of property right away. And I'm saying, well, you've got 20 units and 1/4 of them are currently empty, and you're telling me 2 more are going to be empty by the end of the year. I don't know if your sales pitch is going to work the way you're pitching it.
Yeah, I'm not a real estate pro, but that didn't come across as being a big one to jump on right there. So, and I'm sure there's plenty more buildings are not far from where you were looking.
Sure.
So,
Yeah.
but
Well,
you
Chris,
know,
let's
yeah.
talk about the survey. And before we go into there, I mean, let's just read the title. Let me share my screen here so that the viewers at a later date, when we post all these on YouTube, can see them. So the title of the blog is Survey User Experience is IT's Top Remote Work Challenge. And I want to challenge that briefly because, is security or is user experience, what we talked about yesterday with some Citrix folks is, yes, security is paramount, but if it doesn't provide the user an acceptable, not perfect, but acceptable user experience, then that is going to trump the security needs. So I do agree with the title here that it is our top challenge, but I'm sure security is going to show up in here in our conversation at some point as something that needs to go in the sidecar with it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And in fact, if you look at this first chart, the second most important thing was endpoint security. So we definitely will be talking about that. But the first question was, okay, looking back, and this was a survey from about 269, 70 end user computing professionals in EMEA and North America. And, the question was, what challenges did they face when moving employees to a remote work model? And the first thing was user experience. So that was everything from, do I need to get in with a VPN? Do I, how do I work remote if I've never done it before? I'm used to coming in the office, logging in, and now I've got, how do I do that? And what devices am I, all of that, enabling that whole thing. And we've got stories where, companies scramble to find devices that they could send home with their users if they never really had a work from home computer kind of thing. And that was true for a lot of folks. And getting them functional, getting them productive so they could actually get, at a minimum, just their bare bones work done, but obviously, much more than that, being able to collaborate remotely and everything. And so that was one of the first things. And plus, with everybody being home, kids and spouses and everybody, one thing you can't control is the internet, the bandwidth and everything. And so that certainly can play a part and making somebody productive. We had story after story, I'm sure, where that Zoom call or Teams or whatever is choppy or whatever, somebody has to switch to the phone audio, and you hear, whatever noises in the background. And so that user experience was, paramount to making sure that we could have, something that was functional for the users, but also, they enjoyed it, right? And it wasn't a huge strain on our help desk. But that's kind of what emerged at the top of that survey was 61% responding and that. And you can see it broke down with about, I think, 66% North America mentioned. Now we're about 52% in EMEA in this particular survey. So, and right after that was security, sort of.
So Chris, can
Yeah.
we stay on the user experience one real quick?
Yeah, please.
So let's just hit some of the key topics there. I work remote all the time. I use virtual apps and virtual desktops all the time. My complaints currently in my own environment is we haven't 100% proven Teams optimization on every single device in the portfolio of endpoint devices that we use. I have to go through a couple of extra steps to go from logging into my computer to securely logging into my virtual desktop. What are some of the high level items that make up user experience? I know you mentioned some of them, but let's roll through them for our end users. Graphics display speed within the virtual desktop. That's one that we at XenTegra recently fixed by putting NVIDIA cards into our virtual desktops. Using the browser versus using the app client to make the connection and also get logged into the environment itself. What are some of the other ones that you guys are seeing when you talk to customers?
Yeah, probably one of the bigger things, just sort of on that unified comms focus. What came to light was the endpoint does actually matter. The type of endpoint what type of processor it had, how much RAM, that type of information was, what was the network connection like. And so, in the course of the last year, Citrix certainly came out with Teams optimization, and there was a great demand for it, and trying to offload a lot of the experience down to the endpoint. But what we often saw was, if there was no standard endpoint or some type of standard, you would see end user experience suffer because the machine was just getting crushed or things were crashing, webcams weren't optimized, that whole experience was just getting impacted. And it could have also been something like you mentioned, putting on the back end NVIDIA cards, depending on the workload. But I think by and large, figuring out what type of endpoint devices do I need, do I have older machines that meet the minimum or above the standards that are required for Teams or Zoom or whatever, WebEx, or am I going to have to look at getting new devices? And then you face the fact that there's a device chip shortage things, and so you're kind of scrambling to figure out what options do I have. So those are some of the key things that really emerged, I think. Not to mention there was multiple updates from all these vendors, from Citrix, from Teams, from WebEx, clients this with fixes that, as they've tried to tweak and modify and add new features and functionality. So just staying on top of that from an IT perspective and updating that is still a challenge. IGEL, I can kind of talk through how IGEL kind of emerged through that, and how we've added some new functionality to help with that. If that makes, if we want to talk about that for a minute.
We can. So, but you said something a minute ago I wanted to ask about. You talked about processor and memory. Legitimately, well, if we're running IGEL, what do I need for? We'll say processor, but that should be an easy one. And what do I need for memory if I'm going to be, without doing offload optimization, Teams, Zoom, others, without doing those, what do I need minimum memory wise? And then what if I'm doing those offloads? What kind of memory do I need?
Yeah, that's a great question. So from a RAM perspective, minimum would be 2 gigs. Recommended would be 4 for the endpoint itself. And if it's an actual thin client, those are usually specs that are out there. If it's some type of machine that was running some other operating system, Windows, for example, it's very likely that's going to have at least 6 gigs of RAM, so that you're going to be fine there. But the processor and clock speed was also one. I think I don't have it in front of me, but I think if that was an Intel AMD, running at 1.6, gigahertz or whatever, or higher, you were in pretty good shape. But anything lower than that, that's where you begin to suffer potentially.
So Chris, if you're doing the offloading, you really recommend at least 4 gigs of memory, right?
I would, yeah. And we actually came out with a tool to kind of help map user requirements. So this, Teams offloading with Zoom, whatever, and sort of matching what the specs were based on what's documented, and then mapping that to the endpoint hardware. Will that device have what it takes to meet that use case? And so there was a scramble to try to figure all that out, because there's information in lots of places. And so we're actually coming out with a tool. If it's not ready now, it'll be ready in early July for partners and others to help kind of figure that out. Here's my use case, talk to the customer, they have this need. Okay, what options do they have if they're looking at repurposing or buying new hardware and they want IGEL on it?
And I guess there's a degree of it depends too, right? So I've got a tablet in my office today. It's when I get there at some point today, and I'm installing Windows 10 Pro because I'm going to join it to the domain, Azure AD domain, or Azure AD is what I'm going to be using. Anyway, it's going to join our domain, and I'm going to do offloading on it. It's got 4 gigs of memory. And then I start to wonder, well, what if I'm going to have Chrome open and 15 tabs open, and all of a sudden that's eating away at my memory too. I guess it kind of depends on not only the bare minimum that it has, but also how you're using it in conjunction with the virtual desktop and the offloading, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, notorious Chrome certainly can, multiple tabs, it'll eat up a lot of memory. And that can certainly, if you're trying to access that memory while doing a Zoom call or Teams or whatever, you may run into performance issues there for sure.
Mhm.
Um,
So what else on the end user side? And we talked about, the login process, single sign on with
Yeah.
multi-factor.
Yeah, we've only touched the surface. This is great. I mean, you mentioned it earlier, right? The user experience, if I go through the browser to access my environment, right?
Well, hold on.
Yeah.
Let's clarify that for a few people that don't eat, sleep, breathe this stuff like we do. There's using a browser to get in, but then when you click on an icon, it launches the client to connect.
Mhm.
There's using the browser to get in, and then the browser to connect. And I think what you're getting ready to highlight is, and then there's also using the app itself to get signed in and to connect. So there's really three main ways of doing it. Thank God we don't have to worry about the Java plugin stuff anymore. That's a whole nother funny, horrible scenario all at the same time. But anyway, there's three really ways to get going into a virtual app or virtual desktop session. And then what you're going to highlight is the user experience may be different across the spectrum of all three.
Right. Yeah, that certainly depends on what type of client. But if a user was normally used to just sitting down, logging into Windows, for example, and then accessing their workspace when they go home, and they're not on an always running VPN connection, now what does that experience look like to get in, be able to do their job? Now they're logging into maybe Citrix in a variety of ways, or it's the Horizon client or Microsoft client or whatever, and if it's just password off now, but then you throw in multi-factor because your security team says we got to lock this down, what does that do for the user as far as, is it easy to understand? Is it a great user experience, or is it, you just sent them something that generates a code every 30 seconds or whatever, and they got to carry that around with them, or is it a mobile app?
And are they on the airplane at that particular moment when they're trying to get in? Or are they placed with bad connectivity or bad cell service? And you kind of glossed over the very first one, which is number 4 on your list, which is VPN issues. The biggest VPN issue I see is why the hell are you using a VPN to begin with the the proxying capabilities, reverse proxy capabilities that are built into all these products these days.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably number one there was everything in order to get to the VPN. Their stuff was in a data center that wasn't necessarily cloud hosted, certainly, and so you kind of tethering that line in through the VPN connection. And if you had users that, what's a VPN? I never had to use that before, so that it could be that they just didn't get it right when they logged in, or there are truly issues, with the VPN concentrator or whatever, trying to handle a massive uptick in connections. So,
well, let's even go back before that, because you got number 5 or 6 on here where, I go to turn on my Windows laptop, which I haven't used in a month because I've been using various different devices, my PC or thin client or what have you. And then all of a sudden it's got like 15 minutes worth of patching to do. I haven't even got to my VPN yet at that point, but I'm sitting here, tapping my toe, trying to get going with my work.
absolutely. Yeah. And then what if that's not a device that you manage? It's or maybe it is, but the user has to wait for it to get updated before they can do that. And what if one of those patches doesn't work out well and it fails, or something happens during that update process? So those certainly were some challenges that were faced. I'm sure some folks still do. But what we've seen in this survey is sort of the rise in massive uptick in cloud adoption, which we'll talk about here in a little bit.
Well, I think the reality of this user experience portion of the conversation is there's a bunch of things. Some of them we haven't and can't think about at this point because it's environmental. For example, maybe you use a very, very intensive antivirus on your endpoint systems if they need one. Maybe yours don't need them, or maybe your CISO says, I don't care what the operating system is, we're going to have one. There's all kinds of decision tree moments in the architecture of this story that creates a plethora of end user experience possible issues, slowdowns.
Absolutely. And I think if you look at that chart, all that stuff below that first one, it kind of builds up like a pyramid up to the very top. That's kind of what you're working towards. And my last company, we came out with at some point just the idea wasn't new, just rephrasing it, make security invisible. It's there, but it's so seamless and user friendly that it's it's easy to implement, and the user experience does not suffer. So, but you were getting ready to scroll down sort of some of the next parts of the survey here.
Well, I think we've touched on security still being a critical concern. And I used the word a minute ago, acceptable end user experience. Do we want it to be the best? Absolutely. Do we need to understand there's a blend between being secure and maybe not the simplest, easiest user experience? That's certainly a yes. Our goal is to make it secure and easy all at the same time. But that can't always be the case. I do have to have you have a username and password. I do need to have you use multi-factor. Even I, huff every once in a while when I go to log into my system and I got to stop and find my phone and accept a push notification, but I can't not have that.
Yeah, most certainly. I mean, I've added it and turned it on with more or less a lot of my online stuff, and occasionally don't have my phone with me, and I realize, oh, I got to go back downstairs and grab it, and sure enough, it's waiting for me to acknowledge that push or punch in that code that was sent. But I accept it because I know I feel like it's not too intrusive. It is sort of user friendly. I just need to make sure that I've got that thing with me when I'm logging in, because I'd rather it not be the opposite, where somebody doesn't have it and gets in and now I'm screwed. So but yeah, this is some of the highlights here. We talked about them already. I don't know if we need to go too much in it, but I will, in the bottom there, we've talked about this on prior podcasts, that vulnerability phishing attacks and ransomware and things like that, but also that that 9%, right? The lack of access control, remote users, contractors, the concerns that they had once they were allowing people to work from home. Did they know who was coming in at all times? How could they have some visibility on that? And what could they do to maintain some level of security that allows them to control all of that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, I'm going to go really weird on you here, but I just got back from a fishing trip. Your 11%er here says increased vulnerability to phishing attacks. And it has a circle hook. You know what a circle hook is?
Yes.
So a circle hook is a hook that it's not like the old fishing where you kind of let the fish swallow it, or you jerk the line and try to set the hook in their mouth. It's really one that just kind of gradually sets on its own inside the fish's mouth based on the fish chewing and eating the food. That idea that users are kind of doing it to themselves is very visual here in the idea that you have a circle hook. I may be stretching that. That may not have been the intent of the person who put the article together. But a massive piece of this has to be the education of the end users not to put the hook in their mouth and set the hook themselves, which is a big chunk of what happens these days.
Yeah. Well, certainly the hook would be that initial attempt to get them to do something, right? Bite on the line, bite on the little morsel there. I saw something yesterday, an email that thankfully it landed in my junk mail, but I was like checking to see, I was like, what's in junk? And it was an email from an exec. And if I had not been paying attention, I was looking, is there a link there to click on? I think it maybe got obscured or whatever, but still, and if you read it, it was obviously written by somebody that doesn't have English as a first language. So, but it was clearly some sort of attack attempt, and I just forwarded it to security and deleted the email.
Yeah.
So
Well, what's interesting for me, you said you forwarded it and maybe you did, but I have to train my own internal employees not to, like, they literally in the past would take a phishing email that wasn't for me, that you could tell because the domain wasn't exactly ours. It might have been XenTegra or something. And they take that and they forward it to the entire company. Hey, be on the lookout for this. Well, you just forwarded it to the entire company. Like, you did the last thing I want you to do.
Yeah,
Take a screenshot of it or something, or like you did, send it to security only, maybe.
exactly. Yeah, that's what we do. We've been told there's a security email address, which basically puts it in a ticketing system, and send it there, delete the email, and then they'll take it and deal with it if they need to.
Yeah.
Um,
The whole point there is getting end users to be on the lookout themselves. If you go and if you're on the subway in New York City, one of the signs on every wall is, if you see something suspicious, say something, see something, say something.
right.
That is the best defense we're ever going to have in all these different realms of security, is to just be on the lookout. I mean, that's because we can't, as a system, we can't always outthink the bad guys. They are going to outthink us because they know where the playing field is, and they just kind of keep evolving beyond the playing field. And that's the one, human element that we can continue to try to evolve, in addition to doing these other security things. But that's the one we have to eventually rely on at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think that I think about my own career. I've been now 25 years in the working world post college, and my first career was working for a defense contractor, and I was involved with security awareness training. And I think about where that started. You have a clearance, you work at, this, you are working on missiles this or satellites that or whatever, and you're at a gathering, right? And somebody asks you what you do, what do you
Yeah.
say? They wouldn't technically be able to reach you because the internet wasn't as widespread and it wasn't that type of awareness. It began to get there as we began to network in the 3 years I was there. The whole company networking changed, and all of a sudden we had, internet. And whereas when I first started, we had one ISD line, one machine, and a cubby hole, and that was it.
Yeah, I made the joke yesterday that, hey, if I want to really be secure while doing this podcast, I'll go and plug it from the internet. Well, that won't work so well for the recording.
Yeah. But you can see here sort of with the transition on this blog, it kind of takes, we talked about the user experience, talked about security, but sort of this uptick, and how can we kind of bring them both together? And I mentioned that we did a recording on this last week. I think I saw some statistic from Microsoft CEO Satya that said in about 2 months they saw like 2 years of innovation occur with this massive adoption of Teams, for example, and others platforms. I saw it happen literally before my eyes with my wife, who was a teacher, and their school, and just a matter of less than a week, made the decision not to return to school, adopt Teams, take their teachers through training, figure out how they're going to do that, and also train the students, and then make sure that they're recording the classes and all this other stuff, and just watch my wife go through that. I was like, I'm on standby for help desk just in case she needs help here, but she adopted it. But yeah.
Can we talk about that Windows virtual adoption and moving it to the cloud? So first of all, yes. I've been saying since the late 90s, we need to move to a virtual app, virtual desktop platform. My challenge with your comment a minute ago around Microsoft saying to do this, they have been my biggest nemesis along the way, because they really wanted the deployment model and SCCM and then Intune, or whatever the different product name was called along the way. And then all of a sudden, when it makes sense to put it in the cloud, because now they get cloud consumption money out of it, and then potentially they get double the sale, they get the endpoint sale and the cloud. All of a sudden, it was a great idea. I'm extremely happy that they're on board now. It makes these conversations easier with clients. At the same time, they're the ones that held me back for 5 years, because they were saying, no, don't virtualize it, physically deploy it, and use our tools to deploy it. Now all of a sudden, it's a great idea to use their tools to deploy it in their cloud. And yes, this is great. Let's do that.
Yeah, no, it is an interesting take, because I remember, like you were saying, when I was in the healthcare space and we first had our first zero client thing, I was like, this is going to be the next biggest thing. It's going to be amazing. I mean, why would somebody not adopt a virtual desktop? It just makes so much sense. And then as I began talking with partners, I was like, what's going on? Like, well, there's a VDA tax out there for what is that? Well, Microsoft doesn't like it if it's a non-Windows endpoint accessing a virtual. I was like, and they had all these things began to emerge. And but to see that change now, I mean, the long and short of it is, depending on your, Microsoft 365 licensing, sort of that what type of endpoint you're coming from, you're not going to get taxed. But
Chris, the problem I'm running into is all those years of educating people on cheap, low cost deployed devices. Some people are still stuck in that. So I go meet with a client and he's like, well, that virtual desktop plus the endpoint cost me $50 more than if I just bought a PC and gave it to my end user. And like, that's $50 at the time of the, buying of acquiring the hardware, but it's hundreds, if not thousands of dollars plus security risk over the lifetime of running that piece of hardware. Like, well, but yes, but it costs $50 more. I'm like, oh my gosh, are we really debating 50? Have you been brainwashed that much into thinking $50 savings on day one is really worth it in the long run? Still battling that one in lots of places.
Absolutely. I'm sure of it. The status quo is, of just the way we've done it. This is how there's another way of doing things. I'm not familiar with that. I'm just going to go with, just give me that price you just gave me.
I use Doug Brown's thing all the time. I'm too poor to buy cheap. And people do that, right? They buy cheap. I got a customer right now getting ready to they've got 1,000 users, 500 on VDI. They're going to replace the VDI with laptops again because they can save, they got an extra $50 off each laptop. I'm like, what in the world? But that's how they've been brainwashed into thinking.
Well, these stats here in this article kind of talk about sort of, basically, following the pandemic, what changes do they anticipate coming out of this that's going to have a security and user experience play? And it touches on, certainly the increased adoption of VDI. Number one answer there was 58%. The increased adoption of cloud workspaces, DAS.
So Chris, before we move away from that first one's really important to you and I, as well as the rest of them, but increased adoption of virtual desktop computing, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be VDI specifically, but virtual desktop computing, which means two things. It means more than likely virtualizing the machine workload, but you don't have to, you can use physical. But when it says virtual, what it really means is virtual delivery from a secure location. And it's important that people know that just adopting VDI is not the answer. It's adopting the appropriate VDI with the appropriate best practices or recommended practices for your organization. That's the security piece. The VDI in itself, if you're using non-persistent workloads, that's a big help, a big step in the right direction. But there's probably another 100 or 200 decisions that need to be made to truly make it the answer for improving your security posture.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is a tool in the shed. Is it the right tool for what you need? And then, of course, are you going to host that infrastructure, or are you going to let somebody else do it for you, or are you going to begin to adopt and allow a big vendor like Amazon or Microsoft to have that infrastructure? So, but we kind of talked on it earlier, just, that seeing that increased adoption of an acceptance of cloud workspaces, DAS in this case, Windows virtual desktop, certainly now Azure virtual desktop. We're starting to see more interest in that. Microsoft certainly pushing hard for, as we talked about earlier, for cloud consumption and
So Chris, can we put SaaS in that bucket too while we're at it? Workspaces provided by someone else, desktop as a service provided by someone else, and then software as a service provided by someone else, so that all these security concerns are no longer your problem. They're somebody else's problem. They still exist, but now there's somebody else's problem to be an expert at solving.
Yeah, I think that there should be a SaaS on there. I think it's, just the last 10 years, I mean, so many companies have emerged because of an offering from Amazon where they could host that infrastructure in the cloud.
Mhm.
And how many companies, Salesforce is one I'm thinking of, that just, cloud hosted CRM, right? And many more as well. And now what would we do without it? Certainly companies accepting that, migrating their, adopting or going cloud first, that's been around for a while now. But looking at the rest of this thing, we've kind of touched on a little bit. IGEL being what it is, right? Adopting a Linux-based edge operating system from a security perspective ties into, being able to manage those endpoints. And certainly, converting one. I mean, there's a little bit lower on this, but I think we've certainly seen customers emerge where they do adopt those strategies above, and a key part of that is making sure they have a good solid endpoint strategy.
And this says adopt a Linux-based edge operating system. Is that because Linux is completely impenetrable, doesn't have issues with the software? Maybe, probably not. But a read-only managed operating system using, solution using Linux, yes, that helps a ton. It's also just a matter of a much smaller attack vector where we're not dealing with the consumer user and all the bad stuff they might spread in the Windows world, proliferating over into the commercial use cases.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, certainly, I think there's education around the benefits of a Linux-based edge OS. IGEL certainly has quite a bit there on that topic, but the attack vector being much lower, not a lot of proliferation of trying to find vulnerabilities. I mean, if you literally have like one port open incoming for the most part, and only open up other things when you need them and shut them off when you don't, that's much better than having a more wide open system that's much more widely out there and certainly more vulnerable. But I think I think I find myself educating a lot of folks on the benefits of having that Linux-based endpoint. So this next topic is, where do they see their employees working from post, during, and certainly post? I think during them, certainly a mass uptick of working from home, but very curious as to where things will be after or post pandemic. Some folks are saying, depending on red, blue, whatever, we're still in it, we're not, sort of, we're coming out of it, whatever. Regardless, with the vaccines beginning to get out there, companies, I mentioned it earlier, that a friend of mine that works in the biopharmaceutical, they're already seeing people make decisions job-wise of going to another company because they offer going forward the ability to work from home, whereas some employers are still like, no, I got to come back and fill seats in these chairs and everything. So I think this is still emerging. I think we've touched on it before, that HR becoming a key part of, providing a great user experience. And what does that mean? I think the hybrid work from anywhere is here to stay in many respects. And who knows? I mean, we'll see. And obviously, you built a company on the ability to work from anywhere. That's allowed you to expand certainly into different parts of the country, providing that. And I think that's going to be a key thing. Once companies that are traditionally brick and mortar realize that I can hire and have people working from multiple locations. Yeah.
Well, it's going to be interesting, and this is going to get kind of philosophical and political real quick. Maybe not political, but I have built a work from anywhere company so that I can enable work to get done from anywhere. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I've had employees unfriend myself and other people on social media because many days you could see them out doing fun stuff in the middle of the afternoon because no one was there to watch them work. Right? They're still making enough money to satisfy themselves. At the same time, they're out for a nice hike at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a couple days a week. Really interested to see where the American worker at least ends up in all this, because Chris, I'm not gonna lie to you, there's a ton of people out there taking advantage of us right now.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, yeah, we could go off on a tangent on that one, just sort of being accountable to yourself. If you've never really, you know, for me, it's just sort of ingrained because I took a job, 15 plus years ago where I didn't have a supervisor that was walking around in my house. I had to be self-motivated. I had to schedule my calendar. I had sometimes people were telling me I need to be here, whatever, but I had more or less control over that. And it allowed me to balance work life and home as my kids were growing up. Sometimes that was a little, tilted in one direction or another, but it wasn't so bad that, it got to a point where I just said, you know what, I got to find something else, but yeah, I'm sure of it, and so there's some other challenges certainly of what's happening, with employees that are just not necessarily doing what they should be. But
well, and the story here is we can't necessarily watch them because they're not in the office, but we can look at analytics, and it will become more and more of a focus on the industry. I went to a party not too long ago on a Saturday, and a guy was a consultant there, and he said at the beginning of the pandemic we had super massive productivity in our employees, and then afterwards it's kind of dropped down to an all-time low. I think we're going to start seeing that become something that's evident in our workforce, and it's going to be a balance to figure out how do you keep people happy, but at the same time expect them to put in a full day's worth of work.
yeah, no, I wasn't counting hours. I know I put in a ton, more than I probably needed to, but IGEL did implement sort of company days, not the traditional holidays, but sort of once a quarter, mental health, employee wellness days, I guess is what we called it, and encourage you to go do something, go get out, have fun, so I think that right balance is certainly a good approach. And this, as we kind of wrap up sort of the survey here, right at the very top, employee experience management, kind of what we were just talking about, this sort of is at the very, not just the working digital kind of workspace experience, but I think that overall, collaboration, being part of a team, do I understand the company's mission and what my part is in it, and do I have the tools I need to succeed? I think that's a key part of all of this, if you're going to give that flexibility. So what have you seen, I guess, talking with some of the customers that you've worked with in the last 6-8 year, roughly?
I guess even prior to the pandemic, the idea, the rise of the chief experience officer concept, and having someone on the team responsible for heading up that entire initiative. I will, so the table we're looking at here, that for our listeners, is what additional EUC priorities do you see over the next 12 months? I'll go straight down to the last one, and that says a move to desktop as a service, but I want to be really clear on that. Desktop as a service does nothing much for you if it's not a managed desktop as a service.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people are confused by the offerings out there from Citrix, Microsoft, Amazon, you name it. Just because you sign up for a desktop as a service doesn't mean it can do you any good unless you have someone, either internal or external like us, helping you to manage it and make it proficient for your users, from a user experience as well as from a security perspective, which we've talked about a ton here.
Yeah, certainly. For those that are interested, certainly just go to the IGEL blog, look up survey user experience. It's probably right up there near the top. They can kind of dig into a little bit more. And always happy to chat if anyone reaches out on LinkedIn or otherwise, yourselves. It's always fun to talk, not just technical, but certainly what's going on in the industry. And enjoyed chatting about this with you, Andy. Always a pleasure, man.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, a week full of end user experience and security stories, without a doubt. I'm trying to move away from some of these conversations because we talk about it so much, but it's just so important at this point that just totally makes sense that it keeps coming up, and hopefully listeners are still finding value in that. And we'll find some, like with Seb, some specific widgets to talk about in the coming weeks.
Well, a little tidbit. I think the next one we should do from a corporate is IGEL is actually going to be sponsoring a booth at the upcoming HIM show in Vegas, healthcare show, which I've done many years before. But I want to talk about some of the cool things that we've been working on. Get away from sort of they will tie into that user experience as always, workflows, but we've got some cool things that we're excited about.
Yeah, when is HIMSS?
August 9th through the 13th.
Okay. All right, cool.
So hot time in Vegas.
No, without a doubt. Well, Chris, I'll let you go, and we'll do it again next week.
All right. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.